This is part 3 of our Watercolor for Beginners series, and today we're going to be talking all about water control and how to do some washes. So we're going to be doing a flat wash, a gradient, and a complementary color mix. And then we're going to be doing some wet on wet and how to lighten your colors. And we're going to be talking about wet on dry and dry brushing and different techniques like glazing, lifting, masking fluid, and gouache. So stay tuned for all that. So first we're just going to talk about how to lighten your watercolors. So in watercolor, to lighten your colors, you add water, not gouache or white paint or something like that. That's going to make them more pastel and more opaque. But just to generally lighten colors, we're going to add water. So we're going to go through that real quick here. And I'm going to grab a pretty dark color. So I'm probably going to go with this Prussian blue, because this is a pretty dark, bright blue. So this is what this color looks like here. It's one of my favorite colors, and I'm getting it pretty thick. So I want a pretty thick consistency to start with. So like this. So we're just going to start with this, and all I'm going to do is just put this color down, and you're going to see it's pretty thick and it's almost like dry brushing, and we will get onto that later in the video. But if I want to go ahead and start lightening this color, all I want to do is just dip my brush in and run some of that color off the side of the cup. And then I'm just going to go back in and do another wash. So you can see now our color's already going down. I'm going to dip back in again and just push a little bit of that color off my brush. Now, because I'm pushing the color, also water is coming off of my brush. So we're also working on our water control. Now maybe I need just a smidgen more water. And as we get lighter, we can, dip back in and get even more off if we want to get even lighter. But you see, we're sort of getting a controlled mix. So just practice with how many times. So I'm sort of doing it 3 or 4 times now, really to get a lot of that color off my brush. And you can see just how pale we can go, and you can even keep going paler if you want. Now I'm going to show you doing the exact same thing, but not controlling our water like that, so not running it off the side of the cup. So I'm just going to add a little bit more where we get a little bit thicker paint. And so we're going to do the same thing here. So I'm going to grab a bunch of this Prussian blue, and we're going to do it down here. And we have enough paint to fill in the area, but not too much. Then I'm just going to dip right in and get some water, but I'm not taking the water off of my brush. And I'm going to go back in, and now you can see just how watery that is. It's also lightened the color, but again, it's quite watery, so we're getting a little bit of a different effect. And maybe I'll even go in and swish it around to get a little bit more color off. So I'm lighting it. It's lightening the color, but we're also getting puddles of water there. So there, that's pretty light there. So as these ones dry, you can see how we got like a nice flat consistency in color here. But as these ones dry, you're going to notice, you're going to notice where the water is pooling a little bit more down in this area. It might cause some of those little blooms to come up. So this is the first thing you want to start playing around with water control. Just being able to control the color as you're putting it down. And I find it really great to run your brush off the side, but if you're having trouble with that, you can also just lightly pat it onto a piece of paper towel and control it that way. So this is one of the first ways that we're going to start controlling. So I'm going to let these go ahead and dry, and then as they dry, you're going to see what I mean by they're just not going to dry as evenly, especially with the more water that you have down on the paper. So now we're going to go ahead and work on some washes. So I'm going to do a flat wash where it's just one flat color if you want to get a nice flat area like this, but a pretty big area. Then we're going to do a gradient where we go from dark to light. And then we're going to do 2 different colors, like complementary colors, so probably a blue and an orange. And this is also really great to practice. So I'm going to pick a nice color here. So maybe I'll go with my dioxazine violet, because this is a nice dark color. Now I want to mix up enough wash so that it's going to cover the whole area. So what I suggest, especially when you're first starting out, is mix more than what you think you're going to use. So I'm just going to take my little pipette here and get a little bit of clean water so that I'll have hopefully enough paint to be able to cover the area. And you can also use a separate palette if you need to, one with wells like this. If I'm doing really watery washes, I'll use something like this because I can get quite a lot of paint and different colors if I want to add different colors in. But I'm just going to mix up this dioxazine violet right now. And I still want it to be pretty dark, so I'm just adding more pigment into it. But I need it to be wet so that it's going to flow very easily. So that's probably good there. Now, what we want to do is, as we're taking this color down, we want to make sure that we have a lot of water. So where the bottom edge of the color is going to be, we always want to leave a little bit of so where the bottom edge of our color is going to lead. So as we're pulling the color down, the bottom edge, we always want to leave a lot more water and pigment so that it doesn't dry and give us a harsh line. And then we can use that to sort of keep pulling the color down. Now, it's always better to do flat gradients on a little bit of a slant because that's going to give you some gravity and help you do that. But we're going to do it on a flat area today. So I'm just going to start, and I'm going to do like a back and forth motion, but I really want to make sure that I have a lot of water on my brush. So as I'm pulling it down, I don't want this edge to dry. So we're just going to keep going back and forth, and I'm just picking up more pigment. I'm not really worrying about if it's too wet or too dry at this point. I'm just really trying to keep it nice and even and just really working that edge. Okay, so now that we're down at the bottom, you can see it's already starting to dry a little bit, but we've got some pigment sort of building up down here. So what we want to do is just dab off any pigment on our brush and just lightly start picking up any extra pigment so that it will be a nice flat wash. Now, we don't want to take any extra pigment where we don't need to, because that's going to create a lighter area. But anywhere that you can see it building up, and especially around tape, if you're using washi tape, I find that's where you're going to notice it build up. And then as this dries, those areas that are still a little bit wet, where it's got a little bit of the paint accumulating on the side of the washi tape, that will bloom out and spread out. There, so I think that's pretty good there, and we'll go ahead and let that dry. Now, I am using Arches paper for this, so you're going to notice if you're doing these exact same steps that your paper might have your wash dry a little bit differently, especially here because I'm already noticing that these dried nice and flat. And again, that's because we're using Arches paper, so it's really going to help us, you know, to the best of our advantage. But if you're using more cheaper paper, you'll see a lot more of that blooming going on because the Arches will soak in that water. And so it creates a flat wash. But other papers, sometimes the water will sit more on the surface, and so you'll get a lot more of that blooming. So keep that in mind when you're doing this and when you're seeing this, because I told you we were going to get some blooming, but you know, the Arches paper is just so good. It's like, nah. So keep that in mind. And another thing I want to mention here, this is an Arches paper pad. It is not a block, but I did go ahead and tape the sides down so that it will act like a block, just to show you guys, even if you don't have a block, you can still get the same effect. So I just went along and taped all the edges down. And then I used some washi tape here just to tape out the little areas that I'm going to use. So this will sort of help you from the paper buckling, doing it this way as well. So for the next wash here, we're going to do a gradient. So I want to start darker and get lighter as we go down. So I'm just going to start with some nice clean water again, because you always want to make sure that you have more wash than what you think you're going to need. But I don't need this one to be super watery, because as we get going, we're going to add a little bit of water to it. But I'm going to take a nice bright blue color here. So maybe I'll take my phthalo blue. This is another one of my favorite colors. And I'm using the Cotman colors for all of these. So this is sort of giving you some other options for colors, but you can use whatever colors that you have. But this is just a really nice, pretty blue. And I showed you how to mix this blue in our last video, which was the color mixing series. Using our warm blue and our cool blue, we were able to get something that was pretty close to this. So I've got a little bit of paint here. Now this paint has a little bit more flow than this one did. So that's what I'm looking for, but not quite as much as this one. So I sort of want something that's a little bit of in between. And I'm gonna start pretty thick at the top. And then as we go down, I'm gonna do sort of the same method that we did here, where we're gonna add water to it. So I'm gonna start with this color, and I wanna make sure I'm getting right up to the edges of the washi tape, and I'm getting a nice even coverage. And then as I go, I'm going to start dipping in and wiping that color off, and then just start coaxing it down a little bit. And then again, I'm going to dip in and wipe off and just start coaxing it down. And this is going to give us a really nice controlled wash. If you want it even lighter, you can swish your brush around. Now, if you notice that it's drying a little bit, maybe don't get as much water off the brush. So as we want it to get a little bit lighter, we want to keep a little bit more water on there, because we don't want to get into dry brushing just yet. So swirl around, get a little bit more off. And then I'm going to really wash it off really well. And then get down here and get almost just water. Now again, as we get down, we're going to have a little bit more water on our brush. So we're going to want to dab that off and just pick up any extra water that we have along the sides. And you can even come back up if you want just a little bit. You've got to be careful while this is drying, but you have a little bit of time to sort of come back into some areas if you want to fix it. But we want to be very careful. So I'm just picking up any extra water there. And along the sides. And that's sort of giving us a little bit of a gradient there. So we're going from darker to lighter, but you want to be very careful once it starts to drying. Here I picked up a little bit too much paint. So as it was drying, it left us a little white area there. Now that's great if you want to add some clouds or something to a sky color, but you want to be very careful with doing this method as well. So we'll go ahead and let that dry now. So for the next wash that we do here, we're going to do a complementary wash. So we're going to have two different complementary colors, but coming together. So this is great if you want to do a nice blue sky and then have like an orange bottom or something like that. So we'll probably do blue and orange. But you want to be very careful where they meet in the middle, because if we have them meeting together, if we know blue and orange creates brown or like brownish muddy colors, so you want to be really careful. So what we're going to do is we're going to do the top wash, and I'm probably just going to use this phthalo blue again. And I'm only going to go halfway, and I want to do sort of a gradient wash again, so that as I get towards the middle, I'm not going to have barely any color on it, and then we're going to come up with our orange. So again, I'm going to get my water and I'm going to start my wash. But I want to already start getting rid of some of this color on the brush, so that as I pull it down, we're getting a really lighter color. Almost to nothing by halfway. And by doing a very light version of this, and I'm going to really wash just about everything out of my brush and get it to where it's just water, really, almost, and then I'm going to dab that off and just make sure I'm picking up any color there. And I'm even going to go in with some clean water, and I just want to get this as light and as clean of a wash as I can. Okay, so we've got our sort of half gradient here. Now this is pretty, it's not very wet, so this is going to dry pretty quickly. But what we can do to even help this is you could take your hair dryer and dry this half, so that as you're doing your orange, the colors aren't going to mix together as much. So maybe we'll do that just real quickly. We'll just hit this. And you don't even have to do the whole thing, maybe just the bottom half, just so this is a little bit drier, so that as we're doing our orange section, it's not going to come up and mix together so much. So now we're going to come in and do the same thing with our orange color, starting at the bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this cadmium orange hue that I have. And I'm going to mix up a good amount of this. Now I've grabbed a different water because my dirty water is mostly blue now. So if I start dipping into this, then I'm going to get a little bit of a muddy color on my brush. And where I want this to be a nice pure transition, I am going to go ahead and use my clean water dryer. Then I can always just dump this out and get more clean water afterwards. But we're going to just do the exact same thing we did, but sort of the opposite way. So we're working up now. And again, I'm just going to dip in and just lighten that color as we're working up. And we're just going to have these two colors just ever so slightly meet. And then I'm going to rinse that out pretty well and dab this off. And just ever so lightly, just having these colors transition together. So just like that. So I hope you guys can see we've clearly got the blue, we've got the orange, but they're transitioning a lot more nicely than if we were just to plop the colors down wet next to each other. So you can still get a really nice gradient between two opposite colors, but you just want to make sure that you're doing a little bit more of a lighter area in the middle. Now, if you were doing this with like your ultramarine and your permanent rose, which is going to make a really nice dioxazine purple, then you don't have to do a lighter transition like this. You can just do both of the colors meeting together, but you're going to get that purple transition in the middle. If you don't want that purple, then you can do the same thing. even if they're good colors that are going to mix well together, you can leave a little bit of a lighter area between the two colors, and you're just going to get the pure form of each color. Okay, so before we get on to the next part, I just want to bring your attention over here now that these have dried completely. So I do want to show you the difference between them. These ones here are a little bit softer, a little bit more of a gradient and transition, but as you can see around the edges, they're more soft too, whereas these ones have a lot more hard edges, and that's because the water pushed the pigment and the paint more towards the edges, so it gives us a little harder edges. So keep that in mind as well for the look that you're going for, and just play around with doing these. So now we're going to get into wet on wet technique, and I'm going to show you the difference between a more dry paint versus a more wet paint and how that's going to spread out. But I also want to show you the difference between paints that don't spread as much versus paints that do spread as much. So first, we're just going to go ahead and mix up a couple of mixes here. So I want a more dry, watery, and then very watery mix. So I think I'm just going to go ahead and pick like a red color. So we'll just go with our cadmium red deep hue. So this was our warm red color. Now I don't want very much water in this mix, so I don't want it to flow around. I want it to be almost dry, but just enough that I wouldn't be dry brushing on the paper, which I will show you guys a little bit later. But just sort of like that. So as we put it on our palette, it moves slightly, but as you can see, if I put my brush through it, it covers up that area, but not really fast. It doesn't whoosh in like water. So that's sort of the mixture that I'm going for. Then I'm just going to grab the same here, but I want to add some water to this so it has a little bit more flow. So I'm just going to dip in and just add a little bit more water. So as you can see, it just fills in that center a little bit more. Maybe add just a touch more like that, so it fills in that area pretty quickly. And then we're going to mix up a third mixture, which is even more watery. So I'm just going to go in and add even more water to this. And so as you can see, it just flows around quite a bit. Okay, and maybe I'll add just a little bit more paint here. So it's sort of like there. So you can see the difference here. This is pretty dry. It's pretty slow to fill in. This is sort of like medium. It fills in pretty quick. And this is like almost like you can't really get the white of the palette. So I would say it's a thick, a medium, and a watery consistent. Now I'm going to take a separate brush to wet this area down, and I'm just going to grab my size 12 silver black velvet, and I'm using my silver black velvet brushes for all of this just so you can see them in action and how they do such a great job, and they really help with water control as well. But these are obviously my favorite brushes, but in part one, I went through a ton of different brush options for you guys if you want more affordable ones as well. But I'm just going to go ahead and take just some clean water, and I'm just going to start putting this down all over this area. So I want to cover this whole area with water, but I don't want there to be any puddles. I want the paper to be nice and wet and shiny. But if you were to lift your paper up, you don't want to see the water running. That means you have too much water on your paper. Now, if you want it to bloom and do different effects, then that might be what you're going for. So then you might want to have a little bit more water on your paper. But if you want to get, a nice transition between your colors, but not have them get out of control, then you want to control how much water you're putting on the paper as well. So we want it to be nice and wet. And depending how big of a surface area, you might have to go over and wet it a couple of times because we really want the water to soak in. And the more that you really let the water soak in and you keep wetting it, the longer you're going to have to play around with your wet on wet. So if you really want to do a nice wet on wet background, like a galaxy painting or something like that, you really want to take your time doing this. So now I'm just looking to see if I've got any water puddling or pooling anywhere, and you can just dab your brush and go along the edges and just pick up any water that might accumulate on the edges like we did in these washes as well. Now, one thing I just want to show you real quick, and I am going to grab my Graham Watercolors here, and I'm going to go ahead and grab my alizarin crimson color. And I just want to show you real quick the difference between this alizarin crimson and my Cotman. Because if I put this down, so I'm getting this pretty thick. This is a pretty thick consistency even. But if I dab this down, you can see how it sort of just spreads out and feathers out a little bit. And then if we add a little bit of water into this, it's going to spread out even more. So you see how we get like those little veinings? So some watercolors will do that. So I'm going to go ahead and rinse this brush off real quick. And then I'm going to grab the alizarin crimson from the Cotman set. Now I don't use this one as much because it is not a permanent color, so it will fade. But this acts just like the alizarin crimson from the Professional will too. But you can see how these just feather out. Now this isn't going to feather out as much as the Graham one, but some colors will feather out like that. So just keep that in mind. But now we're going to go ahead and grab our red mixture here. So this is our least watery consistency, and I'm just using my size 12 brush here because I have it. But I am going to go ahead and put this down on the paper. And as you can see, it will soften out, but it's not going to move too much. So if we go into our second consistency here, which is sort of the medium one, and if I put that down, that's going to spread out a little bit more. And then if we go into our third one, which is quite watery, you're going to see this spread even more. It should. Maybe I don't have enough water in there. But this one will spread out even more. So if we want to keep our colors more in place, and I'm going to go down to my size 8 brush now again, and I'm just going to pick up color right from the palette, and I want to dab off any extra water off my brush, and I'm trying to pick it up so it is pretty dry. And this is where we can start being a little more controlled and get different effects. Now these are going to soften out, but they're not going to spread out as much as this because we're being kind of controlled with our colors. So we could do even a little wash of this burnt sienna here. So we could put down a little wash of this color where this is still a little bit wet, so the edges are going to soften. And then if we wanted to go in and maybe create some fur texture or something like that, I'm going to dab off any of that color on my brush. Now I've just got a face cloth off to the side of me, but maybe I'll go ahead and just grab some paper towel so you guys can see what I'm doing. So I like to just fold it in half. I'm just dabbing any extra color off, and I'm going to go ahead and grab my sepia, and I want just enough water on my brush so that this is going to, you know, pick up and flow. And then you can start to come in and just create maybe some fur texture. And if it's not dark enough, you can go and pick up some more. So if you want to just start creating some hairs, and because the paint underneath is still fairly dry, you're starting to get like a softened effect, but you can still get some precise marks because I know they're not going to bleed out as much as these did. So keep that in mind. Now I find some of the Graham colors will bleed out a little bit more, but you know, if you know your water control at that point, you can pretty much take any brand and make them work for you. So this is one of my favorite ways when I'm doing animal paintings. I'll put a wash down and then I'll come back with some, you know, darker color on top and create that fur texture kind of. So this is really great. And if you want a nice soft transition between colors, if you're doing a background, you can put multiple colors down. Now this is starting to dry, so if you wanted to go back in and add more colors, I would let this completely dry. Then you could wet the whole area again and add some more colors. So now we're going to work on some wet on dry and dry brushing. Now this is another technique that I like to use a lot, is the dry brushing, but I'm going to show you how to go from a wet on dry, so it's just paint, like watery paint on a dry paper, and to get it to a dry brushing form. So I'm probably just going to keep with this red color. So this is the cadmium red hue. And now I want this to be a nice flowy consistency. So we want a good amount of paint, a good amount of water, but the water's not completely filling in that area, but it's still giving us enough to flow on our brush. So we're going to take this and we're just going to start and do a nice line. So we've got a nice consistency here. The paint has filled in the whole area. There's no little white patches in between. So this is a really nice wet on dry. But as you can see, our edges here are pretty defined. So there is a line, a clear line, whereas here they're not quite as defined. They feather out a little bit. It's more of a soft transition. So that's the difference between a wet on wet and a wet on dry. Now, if we want to start getting this a little bit drier and getting more into the dry brushing technique, we can just take that same amount of paint and dab off a little bit, and then we can just keep going. So as you can see, we're starting to get a little bit of that white coming through the paper. Now, Arches paper is sort of a little bit rough, so it's a little easier to get that dry brushing technique, but we can just dab a little bit more off and just keep going. And as you can see, we're starting to get little more white patches in between, and the edges aren't quite as harsh as this first one. So we'll just keep going. And now we're getting sort of more into this nice dry brush technique. So what I like to do with my silver black velvets at this point is sort of bend them a little bit so that the hairs are all like flicking out into different directions. And then I can get sort of like almost like fur texture, and I can just really dry brush some different texture on. You can dry brush, you know, like a flat area like this. You can also go in and sort of dab. I don't like to do that as much with my silver black velvets, but you could dab if you want some foliage, you know, and you could just really play with that texture. So this is going from a wet on dry to a dry brushing technique. So it's really great to know how to do this as well, because this can give you a lot of different effects within your watercolor pieces. Now over in this area, I want to work on some glazing. So sometimes in my paintings, you'll hear me talk about I'm glazing a color over. And what it is I'm glazing a little bit of a more watery color over a wash or a color that I've already put down. So I'm going to go ahead and take this red, for instance, that we have here. So this is the cadmium red hue deep color. And I want to get it so it's pretty flowy, pretty light, but I'm going to get enough water so it's going to cover those colors. So this is what I would consider a glaze. It's a pretty light color underneath of the other colors, or I shouldn't say it's a pretty light color, it's a pretty washed out color. So you could do a dark color with this as well, but when I talk about a glaze, I want it to be very watery. So I'm going to take this mixture and I'm going to glaze it over top of our yellow and our blue here. So because this is a red color going over top of these two colors, now these are completely dry. So I don't want to scrub, because scrubbing could lift the color underneath. I just want to ever so lightly just glaze this color over top. So I'm going to go halfway over this one. And as you can see, it's changing the color underneath of it. Now, because the red is darker than the yellow, it is going to overpower that color and change it a little bit. But it's not quite overpowering our blue. It's changing it slightly, but because the blue is a darker color than the red, it's just going to change it slightly, but it's not going to overpower it. Now, if we were to take our permanent rose here, and let's say we wanted to change this so we've got more of a purple color going on, Then what we'll do is I'll grab our permanent rose, and maybe I want to glaze this color, but maybe I want to glaze it a little bit thicker because I want the color to be different in the end. So my goal is to have this color change that blue to get a purple tone. So because the blue is a little more overpowering than the pink, I need a thicker consistency of this pink. So I hope that's making sense. So I'm just going to take this, take just enough water, just a dab of water, so that this color is going to flow. I still want it to be watery enough, but I want it to be thick enough that it's going to change the color underneath. So there, as you can see, that did the trick. And I am just going to grab enough color just to fill in this little area here. And that did the trick. So we were able to change it because we had a little bit of a thicker consistency, whereas this, we just wanted to wash the color over and change it slightly. Now you could go back over with a thicker color, and if you went a little bit more dark with the red, so let's see if this is dry now. So if we went a little bit thicker with our red consistency, we're going to get a more overpowering color change. So again, just grab enough water just so that it's going to flow. But this is much thicker than what it was here. And we'll just do the same thing. So again, we're getting sort of like a nice bright red orange. And then we're getting more of like a mauve color here. So you can see the difference that you can get. So if we wanted this yellow to be more orangey, we would just glaze over a thicker consistency of that color, or you could just go right on top with your orange or whatever. But this sort of just shows you the difference that you can get by doing some glazing. So now I'm going to show you how to get back to the white of the paper. Let's say you were doing the wet and wet technique and your color went over an area where you wanted it a different color, and glazing that color over it would give you a color that you don't want. Or if you want to do some different techniques, like if you want to do a bokeh look in the background, I'm going to show you how you can take this silver scrubber brush, and I've just got this flat wash of red here, and all I like to do is just get this a little bit wet, and I will use a stencil. Now this is my round stencil that I use, and I like to use this for a bokeh look in a background. And all I'll do is just take this scrubber brush and just scrub right over the pigment. Now I do like these scrubber brushes because they are very hard, very stiff. And this is where a nice stiff brush will come into play for you, because as you can see, it really scrubs at that paper and will lift that color back off. Now you want to be careful. This is Arches paper, so this can take a lot of scrubbing. But if you're using a thinner paper or not 100% cotton paper, you want to be very careful, because you can easily start to scrub up some of the paper that's actually under, because you can actually start to scrub up some of the paper itself, and then that's going to give you a mottled look. So that's what I'll do. I'll just put maybe a couple of little circles next to each other, and that's giving me sort of that bokeh look. And you want to be careful because some of the water will get underneath, so I just wipe that off after a while, but you can just keep doing this with different little circles and you'll eventually get that bokeh look. Now you can also use these scrubber brushes just to remove pigment, so I can take this and just scrub a line that I want to remove, and then I just take the paper towel and dab it up, and that will just dab it up. Now one thing I like with these scrubber brushes, especially these silver, so this is a 1/2 inch silver scrubble oval filbert. I like it because it's sort of got a taper point, so as you can see here, it's giving me a fairly nice, like, soft line. It's not giving me such a harsh edge because it's sort of tapered into a very soft point. I've also got a smaller one here, so if you want smaller areas, you can just do the same thing. if you want a much thinner line, and just grab that down. And if you find it didn't grab enough pigment, just go over it again. Just be very careful once you start going over an area, because if you do scrub too much, it will lift some of the paper. Now, as you can see, it's not completely white, but I can get it like almost white. But you want to take into considerations that some colors are more staining than others. So if I keep going it, and I want to dab off because after a while the color will stain this. So I also want to dab that off, get some more water, and just very gently just keep dabbing that off. And I'm getting pretty close to the white of the paper. Now I'm going to show you also how masking fluid will help save the white of your paper in just a minute, but this is a really great technique to play around with. Now I've also got a Simply Simmons brush here because this is a harder brush, so any brush that has a harder end to it will be good for scrubbing. Something like the Silver Black Velvets or even the Princeton Neptune brushes, because they're so soft, they're not really going to be great for scrubbing off pigment. But something like this Simply Simmons brush, because it's got a hard end, I can really get in and scrub some of that pigment off. Now, it's not going to do as good of a job as something like this. And I just go ahead and wash these out under the sink, and that will get all of the pigment out. Now, some colors obviously will stain, but it will clean them enough so that when I go to scrub another color, I get a white area. And I can just, you know, keep going with this Simply Simmons brush. But you can see it's not giving me as good or as clean of a result, but brushes like this are still pretty good for that as well. So even if you don't have a scrubber brush, just use whatever brush that has the hardest like tip to it or the most snap to it, because that's going to scrub much better. So we'll just do an example. Let's do this Princeton Neptune brush. So this is a size 8 round, and I'm going to dab a little bit of water off, and I'm just going to go in and scrub. And it will scrub some off, you know, but obviously not as cleanly as the other ones. So just take that into consideration. Now, I went ahead and pre-did this masking fluid just so it would have lots of time to dry. And I went ahead and did the Daniel Smith Moon Glow just in the background. I really love this color. You get a little bit of like purple, blue, and pink in it. Now, this is a smooth paper, but on a rougher paper, you'll really see a really cool transition. But I went ahead and used the Winsor and Newton Yellow Masking Fluid, a fine line masking fluid, and the Daniel Smith masking fluid. So that is these here, just because I wanted to try these two out. Now, these two have fine tips to them. So as you can see, this one has a nice tip, but this is the fine line one. And I found that I was really having trouble because it was leaving like a glob of it at the beginning, but you can see you can get a really nice fine line, but I couldn't figure out how to get that fine line without getting that glob of paint. So for that reason, this isn't one of my favorites. Now, the Daniel Smith masking fluid also comes with these little tips that you can put on where you can get a finer tip than this. But again, I was sort of having the same thing happen where some of the globs would come out a little bit thicker on the end, but I was still able to get, you know, some nice fine lines. But my favorite technique so far is just taking my Winsor and Newton yellow masking fluid here and just using a brush, and I'm still able to get some pretty fine lines. But so far this is my favorite, but I just want to try taking them off of this paper and see what it looks like underneath. So I've got a video of different ways to take off masking fluid, but I'm just going to go ahead and use my finger. Now, all of these masking fluids have been on here for probably a week and a half to 2 weeks now, just because I really wanted to give this time to dry, because some masking fluids will rip your paper very easily. But as you can see, the Winsor & Newton one is having no issues at all. This is hands down my favorite one that I've found so far. It's never ripped my paper. I've never had any issues with it. And I've also got a little bit of it over here, and you can see it comes off very easily. So that's the Winsor & Newton one, and it gives us some nice bright lines. It really holds onto the paper even though I'm using a brush. Now I'm going to go ahead and take this fine line one off, and it's coming off just as easily. I'm finding it's not ripping the paper. But I am noticing around these globs where I've put the masking fluid down, more paint has sort of accumulated and it's a little bit darker. So I hope you guys can see that, just where it's sort of made a little bit darker. So the pigment has sort of accumulated around those darker ends, whereas it hasn't around the Winsor and Newton, because that laid down nice and evenly. And then this is the Daniel Smith one here. And again, it's coming off very easily. Now this is on smooth paper, so keep that in mind, but on rough paper, I would think it would come off even easier, because most of the time it's smooth paper that will rip. So that's what they all look like. And the Daniel Smith one, I think, gave the finest lines, but again, some of it still had those little globs on the end of them. So, you know, for that reason, I don't like these two, but I am experimenting with the Winsor Newton, trying to get even finer lines. But that's another way that you can keep the white of your paper, is by using masking fluid. Now, my favorite way to use masking fluid so far is if I've got an object, I want to do the background, I'll use masking fluid around the edges of the object, and then that way I don't have to worry too much about my background color getting on top of my object. I'm not liking it so much if I want to do like little hair textures, because I find once I get my paint on too, then the white looks a little too stark. So one of my favorite way to get white textures like this is by using gouache. So I've got my Winsor and Newton white gouache here. This is the permanent white, and I just use like a size 2 silver black velvet brush, and I will just wet that brush and get into the gouache. Now if I want it to be a little more watered down, a little more translucent, I'll use a little more water, but I can pretty much get some nice fine lines by doing it this way. So you can see here how I'm able to get a thicker line if I want, or I can use the tip of the brush if I want really nice fine lines. So for me, I find I like to use this better than the masking fluid. Now, if I want it to be even more opaque, I'll take a lot more gouache to water ratio, and then I can get even more opaque lines. So if I want it to be nice and thick like that. So just play around with your consistency. Because for me, I find I can control the gouache much better and get the little fine hairs that I need. But everybody, you know, prefers something different. But I still use masking fluid to mask out my objects. But I find if it's an animal or something, I will try to use the background color and try to bring that into the animal to create like these little hair textures, and I find that works a little bit better for me. So next week in part 4, we're going to take everything that we've learned in part 1, 2, and 3, and we're going to do a painting. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a like. It really does help my channel. And make sure you're subscribed and hit the notification bell so you see the next video where we put everything that we've learned into practice and do a painting. Now, I do have a few painting tutorials already on my channel, so you can go ahead and check those out. But next week will sort of be the part 4 of putting this all together. Thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, I will see you in the next one. Bye!